Hello everyone, my name is Charlotte Nitschke and I'm the campaign coordinator at Conservation SA, specialising in water issues. To start with, I'd like to pass over to Faith Coleman. Faith probably doesn't need any introduction. She's a renowned estuarine ecologist and a fierce advocate of the mangroves. So I'll pass over to Faith now.
Thank you. Now, what some of you also know is that I'm a descendant of the first colonists to this area. So Coleman Road and all the rest of that, because the pastoral leases were held by my family. And so I've chosen to be the person up here today doing the acknowledgement of country. And I've chosen to do that because I fully recognise that the way this land was colonised wasn't done in an appropriate manner. And so this land is and always will be Kaurna country. And my way of paying that back today is to make sure that this site is restored back as closely as possible, as it was when my forebears arrived here and quietly squatted on it. So today I would like to acknowledge that this is Kaurna country.
Thank you, Faith. So thank you all for coming. We're really grateful to have such a wonderful attendance. I'd in particular like to really thank Deputy Premier Susan Close. Thank you so much for coming. And also to Mayor Claire Bone, to Deputy Mayor Chad Buchanan, and also to the Green Adelaide Board. We've got a few members here today, so we're very grateful for everyone, and to Tammy Franks. So just a bit of housekeeping. We've got the doors open for a bit of ventilation, so I know it's kind of tricky in this space, but if we could maintain social distancing as much as possible, that would be great. In terms of toilets, they are just sort of at the start of the mangrove trail where that other structure is. So head towards the car park if you do need to go to the toilet. It's a little bit of a walk. And in terms of catering, we don't unfortunately have catering today, but we very much encourage you to support the local pub or kiosk after this wraps up at about 12 p.m. today. So I started at Conservation SA earlier this year, and this was sort of one of the first projects that I sunk my teeth into. So I've been working over the past, several months with Faith and Perry and other experts to kind of pull together this vision of what the community has wanted for quite a long time. It's the result of a consultation progress with community. So we've pulled together sort of the history of the mangroves, the environmental considerations, this being a very globally significant site, and really the vision for what the community wants. And this is sort of divided into sort of 7 management zones, each with really specific objectives. So I've helped pull this vision together, but really largely it's the efforts of the community and of the experts like Faith and Perry who have lived and breathed and worked and loved these mangroves for such a long time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Perry Coleman. Now, Perry probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give her one anyway. So she is a beloved estuarine ecologist and an environmental consultant, but more than that, she's a powerhouse and a really vigorous advocate of these mangroves for a really long time. So really grateful for her to share some words. Thanks, Perry.
Hello everyone, and thank you all for coming out today. Shah has asked me to say a few words, and I can assure you that there will be few, but thankful words, really thankful. The middle of 2020 was a dreadful time for me. The mangroves were dead and dying, and people's gardens here in St Kilda were dying as well. And it seemed that all of our efforts to ring the bell about a very large pollution event, comprising the dumping of hundreds of thousands of tonnes of brine into the salt pond south of town, were falling on deaf ears. By that late spring day that I called out on social media for help, I was desperate. And so many of you responded then. Surprisingly, you kept right on responding. The Save St Kilda Mangroves Alliance was formed, loose, made up of both individuals and organisations, a nimble, responsive group with a big challenge to grapple. I can give you a flavour of the next couple of years here, but there is so much more detail that you could have a look at on the website that we set up. You turned up for that first vigil on Parliament steps, but that wasn't the end of it. You flew everything from drones to high-end research platforms across the coastline to map the impacts. You filmed short videos and published them online, created memes, wrote letters to the editor and your local political representatives. You attended exquisitely painful meetings with agency staff and consumed gallons of coffee, debriefing after every frustration. And when frustration boiled over and a pink hard hat and hired pump seemed the only solution, the Alliance was more than grateful for the welcome and blessing from the traditional owners of this land. And so thank you for that, Uncle Jeffrey, Yandamara and Nadia. So many people responded to the Alliance's awareness raising. Musicians and artists, sculptors, jewellery makers responded with floods of artworks expressing their deep concern, their connection to the land and their distress at the devastation. Teachers brought classes of students to see the issues for themselves, and those classes recorded details that more sophisticated eyes may not have noticed. As they tracked the influx of rolling spiders, who immediately after catastrophe moved in to use up all of the spare dead leaves, and their dispersal once all the leaves were gone. As they watched the precarious survival of the blue wrens exposed to hawks now that their cover was gone, but still wedded to their homes in the shrubby samphire. Some even sat still with me to let the grey fantails flit around their faces as they fed on the mosquitoes attracted to our carbon-laced breaths. The researchers and the university students amongst you brought your sharp, inquiring minds and looked more deeply into the workings of the pollution event. Such detailed studies determining that even though the tide may clean the surface waters in the creeks and pans, the deeper soils were still a pickled mess. That the trees that had survived may not be surviving or thriving, that the necrosis was visible on their salt glands, with impacts on how much salt that they could continue to tolerate day by day, on their ability to withstand cold weather, and on their ability to fend off attacks from herbivorous moths. And even some slightly morbid topics were examined. How long does it take for a dead mangrove to rot away? There were so many of you that at times I thought the boardwalk was Rundle Mall. And as all the researchers will attest, myself included, field work was not only made easier but also much more enjoyable by the willing procession of helpers who came along to carry all the gear and record all the observations. Some of today's faces came together at the Community Visioning Workshop at St Kilda Hall to share your hopes, not only for the area of now dead mangroves, but for the entire coastal strip occupied by the moribund salt fields. A future where the tides could restore the ponds, providing an area for salt marsh and mangrove retreat in the face of rising sea levels, areas of new habitat for shrubby samphires, more feeding grounds for migratory birds, possible ways to manage the stormwater as sea level rise impacts current discharge facilities, and a new and massive sink for carbon dioxide as the coastal vegetation would grow into the thousands of hectares of old saltfield ponds. You envision biodiversity opportunities galore, along with positive spin-offs in the form of increased nursery areas for the local prawn fisheries and ecotourism opportunities. The work that Dew and the universities already had underway at the trial pond north of St Kilda provided us with a small example of how quickly the type of envisaged changes could be realised, and we were hopeful. The workshop results really needed to be formalised if we were to spread them around, and if they were to provide a potential way forward for the St Kilda Mangroves and the old Dry Creek saltfields. But life has a way of getting in its own way, and finding the time and the person to do that was not happening. And this is where our Environment Minister, Dr. Susan Close, came in. The current government committed to working with the community in the 2022 election, and part of that commitment was the facilitation of a grant from the Department of Environment and Water that allowed Conservation SA to hire Charlotte part-time to pull the community vision together for the Alliance. Char, that learning curve must have been horrendous. The reference list alone details the amazing journey that you took to understand the history of the site, the mechanics of the pollution event, and the details of people's visions for this 25 kilometres of coast. But finally, here it is, the St Kilda Mangroves Community Vision and Strategic Plan, all finished. A vision with a plan is, of course, just a start. The next step is bringing the vision to fruition, and I suspect that the road ahead may have the odd lump in it. But today is not the day to think on that, except to say that with the help of many more gallons of coffee, I am sure that we will all be meeting here again one day to celebrate the next steps of this journey to restore this very special stretch of wild coastline that is uniquely embraced by our state's capital into the largest blue carbon site in the state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Perry, for that beautiful story of a very challenging but ultimately hopeful vision for the St Kilda Mangroves. I'm delighted now to introduce Deputy Premier Susan Close. Now, Susan also has a long personal history with the mangroves. She's the daughter of an avid ornithologist and also a very strong advocate for the mangroves. So we're very grateful that she can share a few words. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you. Yes, mosquito-infested visits to the saltfields over the years as a child in the Kingswood to look at birds with my father. It could have put me off the mangroves, to be honest, but fortunately my love for the environment conquered the discomfort that I was subjected to. This work is very welcomed by the government. David Bevan tried to turn that into fully endorsed. And as Perry has just said, today is not the day to identify road bumps, but it is true that it is welcome, and in fact was partially supported by the government, but to a relatively minor extent. The full credit for the work that's happened here, including the effort that it took to bring people together to create this document, belongs to this wide and glorious community of care for this area. But I think we can all agree that if any one person is to be given credit, it must be Perry, and associated with Perry, of course, is Faith. And their joint concern for this area and advocacy has been remarkable. I was just thinking, as the sad story of what happened in 2020 was unfolded for us all by Perry just then, that in fact this document is necessary anyway. That although it's born of a crisis, it is about the future of our shared interest in the mangroves and the saltfields generally along this stretch, and therefore the principles are over and above anything that's required to address the specific crisis that occurred that resulted in the deaths of so many mangroves, as we can see from here. What we need is a shared understanding of the way in which we approach the complexity of this land. And that's why the principles in particular are so welcome to me, because they give a view about the way in which we approach the question rather than an exhaustive answer to what those questions will be. It is a complex area. There are multiple and competing desires for how we use it, but leading with do no harm, leading with a respect for both biodiversity and the consequences of climate change is absolutely essential. And throughout all of that, prioritising the views not only of community generally and science, but specifically and importantly of the First Nations. Again, principles that we can all support and indeed endorse. So I'm grateful to have been invited to see the culmination of this very significant work by all of the people here and many who've been unable to attend. It's wonderful to see that a number of institutions of decision makers is represented here as well. Seeing Claire Bone here as the Mayor of Port Adelaide Enfield, Chad Buchanan, who is the Deputy Mayor of the City of Salisbury, having my good friend Tammy Franks, the Member for the Legislative Council for the Greens, so State Parliament, local government, myself, is important. We also have people from the Environment Department and crucially from Green Adelaide, the Natural Resources Board, as was, Landscape Board's now known as, that takes a deep care and interest in the way in which we can better restore biodiversity and convey to the public how important biodiversity is. And I'll close on this, on the sense of how important it is to the public. I was approached by people all around Adelaide about what was happening with the mangroves. It was a pleasant surprise to me. I wasn't sure that many people would care, and so many people cared. Susan, what is happening with the mangroves was something that would happen to me in the shops, on the street, and of course in my parliamentary office. And what is happening is going to be guided by the principles contained in this plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for those words. We're so grateful. Your support is so welcome. Now, our next speaker was going to be Associate Professor Luke Mosley, who's been one of the key researchers in sort of moving forward and the restorations of the mangroves. Unfortunately, Luke has come down with the flu this morning, so Dr. Alice Jones has very graciously, very last minute, stepped in. So we're super grateful for Alice. She's an award-winning blue carbon researcher, and we're very grateful to have her. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I'm not going to be anywhere near as lovely and prepared as Perry's beautiful speech was. It was very poetic and emotive, and I hope that I can do a little bit of the same and not be too scientific and dry. I am a senior lecturer in resilience ecology at the University of Adelaide. So I look at ecological systems and how they respond to challenges, where their boundaries are in terms of what they can recover from and what they can't recover from, and how they adapt to changing environments. And so obviously was very interested in what was happening here at St Kilda. And in general, I focus on coastal ecosystems. So I look mostly at mangroves, salt marshes and seagrasses all around South Australia and Australia in general. And St Kilda has been one of the places, you might have noticed from my accent, I'm not from here originally. We don't have mangroves in the UK where I grew up, but we do have salt marsh and seagrass. But St Kilda was the place that I really started to understand and learn and fall in love with mangroves, despite the mosquitoes. And I've studied here for quite a long time, and I've brought students here, I've brought classes here. And so seeing what was happening here was quite heartbreaking from a personal perspective, and quite interesting from a scientific perspective. And so we have done some work here, particularly Lucy Wood, one of my honours students a couple of years ago, did a study, and she was looking specifically at the salinity in the soil. So as Perry was mentioning, the salinity was actually higher, deeper in the soil than at the surface. And so that has implications for the vegetation whose roots are growing in the soil. And also it can get missed if you're just looking at surface water, which some people were doing initially. And so we were finding salinities of over 10 times seawater at 50 centimetres deep in the soils. We came back just in June and did some sampling, and we're happy to report that soil salinities have drastically reduced, which is good news. Obviously, the threat has not been removed, so that's not to say that they won't go high again later. But at the moment, they seem to be improved, and the salt marsh vegetation is looking improved. So there's some positive signs, but like I say, the threat has not been removed, and there's a risk that we will get more hypersaline brine going into the groundwater and the same impacts being seen again. And we haven't seen really any recovery in the mangroves, unfortunately, although the soil salinities there are improved. But in general, a lot of my research is on blue carbon, which is carbon storage in these coastal ecosystems. And here in South Australia, we have huge swathes of beautiful salt marshes and mangroves, and we also have a lot of seagrass. And all of these three ecosystems store carbon at very high rates, higher rates than even in the tropical rainforests in some cases. And so they're really, really important for climate change mitigation, and we need to protect them, and we also need to restore them. And so, as Susan was mentioning and others, there's a huge opportunity here along the salt fields if we do a large-scale restoration of those areas back to their native vegetation, which is mostly mangrove and salt marsh. We could be capturing tons and tons, thousands of tons a year of carbon, drawing it out of the atmosphere, and therefore preventing it from contributing to climate change. So there's lots of things to think about in terms of what's included in the vision. And I think from a personal perspective, again, it's hugely rewarding for me as a scientist and as an academic to see our research being useful and informing the vision to some extent, and also hopefully informing some management decisions along the way as well. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you, and well done on the vision. It's really a fantastic job, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the future.
Thank you so much, Alice. Really wonderful and invaluable to have your perspective, and you would never know that I gave you mere minutes to prepare. It was fantastic. So finally, our last speaker I'd like to introduce is Lindsay Virgo, who is the chairperson of the St Kilda and Surrounds Progress and Tourism Association, and also a resident of St Kilda for more than 30 years. Here to share some words on the community perspective. So thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you, Charlotte. First of all, it's great to see everybody here today. As Charlotte said, I'm the chairperson of St Kilda and Surrounds Progress and Development Association, and we've taken a very keen interest in the disaster that did occur, and have put the association in support of hopefully seeing some better mangroves. And I won't get into the political stuff, but usually when someone causes a problem they pay for it. But more so on a positive note, this mangrove trail, just a few little figures about how well it's still patronised. I just got the last month's visitors tally from Robin this morning, and last month there was 446 visitors. Probably doesn't sound much, but bear in mind the boardwalk was actually closed for 15 days of that month. So 446 into half a month is quite a good turnout. On the May public holiday, in just that one particular day where all of St Kilda was actually very well patronised, there was 106 just on that one particular day going through. And Robin also informed me that this morning she had a phone call from a busload of international tourists that she had to turn down. They wanted to come and visit the boardwalk, which is currently under repairs. The storm that went through some 25 years ago, which finally paid to the entire boardwalk being active, has obviously not deterred the number of people. But it would be really great if between the Salisbury Council and the present government could come to some arrangement to restore the full length of the boardwalk itself, I can say that people are missing out on a lot of very interesting mangrove views by not being able to complete the whole trip itself. Whether it's restoring the path in its original position or finding some alternative, it's got to be better than walking 400 metres and then walking the same 400 metres back again. Admittedly, when you see things from a different angle, you do see different things, but to walk a complete loop, I think would add to the experiences of all the visitors that are patronising this facilities. And those visitors come from overseas. We did have a gentleman some time ago from well and truly overseas who had come specifically to St Kilda because he'd heard so much about the mangroves. That's how far wide this facility is known. So on that note, I'd just like to re-emphasise, we've got two ministers or two members of parliament here, that hopefully we can do something with getting this boardwalk extended. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Great to end on a hopeful note. I'm going to pass over to Faith now for some concluding remarks and some gifts for the speakers.
All right, well, I'm receiving texts on here from ex-Senator Rex Patrick, who was hoping to be here but's coming for fish and chips, because he's really, really excited after the huge amount of freedom of informations that he did for us, that we've used that data for something useful. And so he passes on his congratulations. And I would also like to thank Tammy, who's been hugely active throughout this whole process in making sure the St Kilda stuff got up, and also Susan, who, when in opposition, was hugely active as well to make sure that this went ahead. So it's lovely to see in her government that we're starting to talk about a positive vision. And I guess possibly one of the most important things to me, and the most remarkable thing about this project, and I'd like to acknowledge that we do indeed have some of Buckland Park Dry Creek's people here today, and it's so wonderful to see them. But we've got 20 organisations that all put their logos on this plan. We're not talking 20 people, we're talking 20 organisations representing tens of thousands of South Australians and the technical expertise of 3 universities. You know, we've got local businesses, we've got development groups, we've got ministers. There is an amazing amount of support for this. And when we look at the coastline around us, this is and will be Australia's largest blue carbon project. And we've just got to make sure it happens. And so for that, I'd like to thank absolutely all of you. But I do have some special presents here for those who are talking. And I will hand them out in a minute. One is the little containers of honey here that I have, which come from the Toraro family, who keep bees in the mangroves here. And one of the most remarkable products of the mangroves, apart from the fish, and the fisheries guys, unfortunately, were all on leave today, but apart from the fish is the mangrove honey, which is as distinct as something like leatherwood honey from Tasmania. And so it's a major product from the region. And I also have, produced by the old mine manager of the salt field and Perry, a book on another salt field, the birds of an Indonesian salt field. And the reason why we're giving that to our speakers today is because the birds that arrive here go there. And so the photos are something really unique that we don't see here. They arrive here and this is their home and they spend most of their time here. But when they leave, they put their breeding costumes on. They go on a date. They get all dressed up. And so what Kevin's now seeing where he is in Indonesia is our birds who wear their tracky dacks around here, carefully dressed up for their dates. And so I thought I would give our speakers the really unusual opportunity to see what our birds look like on a good day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Faith. I've seen lots of people have copies of the booklet. If you don't have one yet, there should be some extra copies over there. But if not, the report will be available online. Feel free to take the chance to mingle with the community that made this possible. And thank you all for coming.